All right, everybody. Today we're going to get into the culture and development of Europe and kind of some of the social things, governmental things, if you will, that were going on during this period from 600 to 1450, or what is often known as the Dark. That's it, the Dark Ages. It's just black and it's dark and it's terrible. There's things like dirty peasants and people getting tortured and hipster hobbits and wizards and all sorts of crazy stuff, and that everybody believed in magic and all sorts of wackiness, and that there was no smart people and no light. And it wasn't necessarily that bad, but there weren't things that were really good. And of course we have feudalism uh, again, as we see. And if we cover this again for the third time, of course, we hit it in China, and then we hit it in Japan, and now we have it here. The major issue is that you have kings that are not strong enough and do not have enough resources to have a large standing army. And so, in order to get everything under control, those kings would then give land to nobles right here, who then, in exchange for control of the land or a fief, would offer money and knights to the king, money they would collect in taxes, and then the nobles would control a bunch of land, and then they would split their land up to the vassals. In many cases, many of them were knights, and they would also do that with land. They would have land and they would give protection and military service, and then everybody else was a peasant. And the results of this inherently were not good. Serfdom in general could be very terrible. Basically, the serfs had to pay all of the taxes, whether it be money or most often their crops, and as a result, they had to pay taxes on everything. They had to give a portion of their crops just to grow their crops, and then they had to make bread with it, but they had to give up some of the bread or the vegetables, or if they were winemakers, if they were peasants in the winemaking region of, say, France, they would have to give some of their grapes to the Lord, and then they would have to give some grapes to press the grapes, and then give other grapes to bottle the grapes. Like, it's really kind of crazy like that. And the issues that develop for these serfs is that, you know, um, they had no protection. And so here's the flip side, and we'll talk about how it's all not too bad. It is kind of a dangerous time for them, because there really isn't a lot of order. And as you're going to see, there's going to be a lot of fighting. Now, there would be some serfs that were taken care of, and for some of them it was very good. But as the Dark Ages got on, the serfs would be taken care of less and less. And so it was really, really hard. And again, we do have European Fight Club. The problem with this is because the kings weren't strong enough to control all the land, they might not necessarily be able to control all the nobles. And so most often what you would get is nobles fighting each other, which results in a time period of chaos and war, and everything was about honor. So a lot of times nobles would attack other nobles over just really petty insults, or everything was kind of interconnected. So if I'm a vassal and I get in a fight with another vassal, that might bring in both our lords. Well, our lords most often have multiple vassals and knights, and so, a little argument over, say, a border, like a well, can just grow and grow and grow. Also, since the land is the basis of everything, as I'll explain in the economic section, everybody wants to control land, so they'll fight over it, and then the king can't really stop anything. And so you have a lot of fighting and aggressiveness, and unfortunately, you don't end up getting a lot of trade or knowledge because everybody's busy either fighting or farming. Now, it's not necessarily always terrible. During the time period of the Dark Ages, really, from the 700s or so to about the 1300s, you have an agricultural boom. This time period is known as the medieval warm period, in which you had larger than normal agricultural yields. So even though people had to pay a lot of taxes, they could grow a lot of food, and if they grew a lot of food, they would eat more, and if they eat more, they were healthier, and then they could have cool tournaments in which they serve you food, and knights will fight for your enjoyment. In general, they were actually pretty healthy during this time period. The downtrodden serfs come from a period called the Little Ice Age, which I'll talk about a little bit later. Their lifespan actually wasn't too bad. I mean, you had people living into their 50s and 60s. It wasn't uncommon. And localness really isn't too terrible. Most people would live on the same farmstead basically for their entire life, but they are protected from brigands and looters and thieves and other people. And so, it wasn't always as terrible and dark. I mean, if you're running into hipster hobbits, it's kind of annoying, but in general, for a lot of people, it was actually pretty good. Now, society and culture was also very different, and this is going to cause some issues in the future. Basically, you have the development of what we call the three estates. You have clergy, nobility, and then everybody else. At the top were the clergy, and I explained this already. They control your path to heaven. They can also send you to hell. So in the end, the clergy were very, very important. Next to them, you have the nobility, not that many people. These are the lords and the ladies. These are the descendants, really, of those uh, barbarian families that were able to establish control. And in some cases, descendants, believe it or not, are some of some actual Romans that still would live in some of these areas long term, i.e., actually, my wife and her family. Go figure on that. And then everybody else. So a peasant, a merchant, a lawyer, a blacksmith, all of those people basically will have no rights. And what this ends up being is about 5% determines the life of 95%. But that 5% was pretty powerful. And this division, though, will cause problems much later on. But everything is very stratified. There is no moving up in the Dark Ages. If you're born a peasant, you stay a peasant. If you're born a noble, you stay a noble. And then if you're born a noble and don't really want to be a noble, you become a priest. Okay, those are your options. And for everybody else, you just don't really have much opportunity. This also is the time of the knights, and being a knight, you had to be a noble. There weren't that many of them. As you can see there, you see some of them jousting. Um, Knights were interesting. They were mounted soldiers. They would wear that armor, which was really, really heavy. They were very strong. Knights did not fight on the ground if they could help it, because if you take a knight off his horse, you take his biggest weapon away from him. Knights could turn the tide of a battle. If you go into a battle and you have, say, 20 or 30 knights, you're probably going to win. There weren't tens of thousands of knights because no one could afford all the armor and the horses and the squires to help them do everything. But what eventually happens is you do have the development of these tournaments, as you see these knights here jousting against each other, to keep them out of trouble. It was a way that kings would host these great things so that these nobles could kind of fight against each other to show their greatness, and if they did that, it actually could prevent the war. So being a knight wasn't all that bad, but you had to have money. Now, we also do get the development of some art and literature at this time, and the most famous of these guys were the Troubadours. Now, the basic idea of a troubadour, to understand this, was that a troubadour was really a traveling minstrel and actor. And they were musicians that would travel from place to place, really trying to kind of put on a show and entertain people. Now, the only reason they were able to do this is really around, say, the 11 or 1200s. The wealthy had enough money that they could pay these guys. And you also will get the development of the town, which is going to be really important that I talk about later, that gives these folks a place to actually play. They were incredibly influential in that many of them would pass down the great stories of the age, where later on in the 12 and the 1300s would actually start to get written down into poems and plays. They also actually kind of intermingle, if you will, a little bit with the knights, in that we learn a lot about the knights from the songs and the stories of the troubadours. The knights went by a code of chivalry in which they were supposed to act honorable at all times, very similar to like the bushido of the samurai. And the troubadours actually passed down these stories of us and of these great knights and what was really seen as desirable. And pretty much the most famous woman of this age was Eleanor of Aquitaine, who was a pretty famous woman. She was a queen of France and of England. She was married to two kings, and then two of her sons, actually, I'm sorry, three of her sons, became kings of England during the Dark Age period, and we'll talk about some of them later on. She had her own court at Poitiers in France and was really able to foster this development. And these troubadours are going to be important because they're going to help lay the basis for the novelists and the playwrights of the Renaissance. And so, as you can see, Europe at this time, it's not all dark, it's not all horrible. I mean, sure, did people believe in wizards and witches and amulets? And yeah, they did, but there was so much other stuff going on, which is important to understand, and that's why we got to get deep into it. And we're going to even talk about this a little bit more in class, okay? So I'll see you guys tomorrow. Make sure we get our comments and questions, and I'll see you soon.